Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Colonel Ryan Howell, the Army's Director of Integration for CPE Ground, about the service's new main battle tank and the inspiration it drew from both F1 and the video game industry. And then we break down the latest on President Trump's effort to take control of Greenland, the decision so far to not order U.S. strikes against Iran, and the Navy's effort to gather data for future underwater drone operations in the Taiwan Strait. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. And this episode of the Threat Status Podcast is brought to you by Vector. The Army asked for 1 million drones. Vector is ready to build them at scale in the U.S. by warfighters for warfighters. And coming up later this week, we will have an incredible and exclusive interview with Colonel Ryan Howell, the Director of Integration for CPE Ground with the U.S. Army, all about the service's new main battle tank. Our colleague John Seward was at the Detroit Auto Show for that unveiling and sat down with Colonel Howell, so stay tuned for a deep dive into the new main battle tank, unlike any other that you will find. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It is great to be here with you for another episode. One of the main things I'm tracking is the day-to-day on President Trump's push to have the U.S. be the great world power in control of Greenland, the ice-covered and mineral-rich Arctic island that the president and his top national security advisors have really become obsessed with in recent months. In a way that has caused a lot of diplomatic acrimony with U.S. allies in Europe, mainly because Denmark is currently perceived to be in control of Greenland's sovereignty. This situation came to a head at the World Economic Forum gathering in Davos, Switzerland in recent days, Ben. President Trump announced on January 21 that he had struck a framework deal with NATO and European leaders on matters relating to Greenland and the Arctic after intense talks in Switzerland, where Mr. Trump also announced that he would no longer make threats to use the U.S. military to take over Greenland, and that he would drop his threat to impose U.S. tariffs unilaterally on NATO countries to pressure Europe into supporting a U.S. takeover of Greenland. There are a few things we're tracking on this in the Threat Status daily newsletter, Ben. The first is the narrative that's often pushed to the side in mainstream media coverage of this whole situation, and that's the Trump administration narrative that the U.S. should take over Denmark's control of Greenland with the main purpose of preventing Russia and China from accessing the island's rare earth mineral reserves over decades to come, presuming that Greenland's ice melts enough to make mining rare earths actually possible there. It's important to remember that there's currently very little mining activity in Greenland. As far as I'm able to assess, Ben, there are two firms attempting to mine at the present moment, but conditions and infrastructure are so limiting that it remains a mainly theoretical endeavor, to the point, actually, Ben, that one older family member of mine commented quite funnily to me the other night that it's all very interesting. The president wants to buy a giant piece of ice. That aside, Ben, another aspect that we're tracking seriously at Threat Status has to do with the right here, right now factor of Trump's public rhetoric and his claims. And really the extent to which the Greenland issue has become, bombast and hubris and divisive, or is it actually becoming a truly key development in U.S. leadership and in U.S., China, Russia great power competition in 2026. With regard to the deal that Trump claims to have secured in Davos, he described it as long term, and he didn't say whether the deal will ultimately grant the U.S. ownership or sovereignty over Greenland. Sources are telling us that the negotiations in Switzerland focused on some proposals to build up a NATO troop presence, not just a U.S. troop presence in the Arctic writ large, and also to basically give the United States sovereignty over a few parts of Greenland's territory, whether that's to host private U.S. mining interests in the future or U.S. military assets, such as perhaps a U.S. missile defense base, something along those lines. Remember, Ben, at one point over the past week or so, President Trump publicly declared that the U.S. needs Greenland as a strategic location to bolster Trump's push for a Golden Dome futuristic missile defense shield for the U.S. homeland. Finally, Ben, in the day-to-day, there's still major pushback to Trump from Denmark. And critical, predominantly left-leaning European leaders who see this as this kind of political football and a time to try and stand up to this U.S. president who's pushing this Monroe Doctrine style foreign policy mantra at this point. So we're tracking whether or not there will be signs over the coming week or weeks from Denmark that maybe they're going to yield to Trump's pressure a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's certainly noteworthy to hear President Trump kind of step back from this idea of potentially using military force to take Greenland. And, speaking of stepping back from the brink, President Trump also decided against, at least for now, ordering U.S. military strikes on Iran to help demonstrators there and to potentially, overthrow the theocratic regime in Tehran has been a thorn in the side of the U.S. and Israel for a long, long time. And of course, remains the world's preeminent state sponsor of terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, and others. This is interesting because, as we detailed before in the show, and really has been kind of a running theme for the past few months, President Trump has been on a streak recently of ordering bombing campaigns or conducting military operations in countries all over the world, from Venezuela to Nigeria to Somalia, Syria, and so on. He even ordered strikes, of course, previously against Iran last June, targeting 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities. So why was he reluctant this time at sort of the height of those protests last week when it really looked like the regime could be in trouble? I know we've been told by sources that it essentially kind of boiled down to more or less one major thing, and that was that there wasn't a guarantee that U.S. operations, without an actual ground invasion and boots on the ground, could topple the Iranian regime. And even if it did, there was no guarantee that a new leader could emerge in Tehran and prevent major dysfunction and chaos that might force the U.S. to put personnel on the ground in order to get things under control. So, I mean, to me, it seems Trump likes to declare victory and have clear-cut wins, right? We saw that with the Maduro raid in Venezuela. U.S. Special Forces in and out in a couple of hours, no casualties, pictures of Maduro in handcuffs, and 48 hours later, he's in a New York courtroom, and Trump can rightly say the whole thing was a huge success for the U.S. Iran was a very different proposition here, I think. Even under the best case scenario, it seems like it would have been hard for the U.S. to accomplish what it wanted to do without getting into a situation that Trump really wants to avoid, which is a forever war or some kind of prolonged engagement. Even Israel reportedly had some doubts about the potential of U.S. serious action in Iran, including the fact that Israel, of course, would be on the receiving end of any Iranian retaliation, as would U.S. bases in the region like Al Udeid in Qatar. But for now, it looks to me, Guy, like U.S. military action in Iran is certainly no longer imminent and probably, if not off the table, pushed to the back of it right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ben. The situation inside Iran is particularly difficult to assess right now because there remains an internet blackout over the country that's being imposed by the ruling theocratic regime. That makes it hard to know whether there have been more killings of protesters or whether the protests may surge again. There's also the key issue that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is now 86 years old and believed to be quite frail. If you want to sound smart at a cocktail party, Ben, there's the factor here that I think deserves more attention, which is what happens if Khamenei dies. It could result in a power struggle between Iran's military, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and the religious leaders. And that could lead to an even bigger domestic security mess inside Iran going forward. That's something to pay attention to.
Absolutely. One last thing quickly here before we get to John Seward's great interview from the Detroit Auto Show. Our colleague and friend of the show, Bill Gertz, had a fascinating bit of information in his Inside the Ring column this week, which is a must read for anybody who wants to stay on top of national security, foreign policy news, but about how the U.S. Navy earlier this month sent a survey ship alongside a guided missile destroyer through the Taiwan Strait to gather key data for future underwater drone operations. This isn't unprecedented, but it's certainly noteworthy because these survey ships are equipped with sensors that collect data to be used for what the military calls battle space awareness and maintaining tactical advantage underwater. The ships can aid with seafloor mapping, production of high-resolution 3D maps, information critical, for both safe submarine and offensive and defensive underwater operations. They can measure temperature, salinity, pressure, all pieces of information valuable for tracking Chinese submarines based on how sound travels through the water. So we talk a lot on this show, and rightfully so, about drones for the aerial perspective, but this is a great example of how underwater drone operations would be such an important part of any major future conflicts, especially one in a theater like the Pacific, where all kinds of maritime and naval capabilities obviously will come into play, including underwater drones.
So we're here at the Detroit Auto Show. Sir, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Colonel Ryan Howell, Director of Integration for CPE Ground.
Thanks for joining us for the Threat Status Podcast. So what are we standing in front of right now?
So you're standing in front of the M1E3 early prototype.
Okay.
And we're building a platoon set of these, and we're going to get these into the soldiers' hands this calendar year so we can begin to get feedback rather than a normal acquisition cycle and wait till the end of the cycle to get the feedback on stuff you probably can't change. So we're trying to do that in advance of production.
Why debut it at the Detroit Auto Show? This seems like a little bit of a change. I mean, USA is normally where we show off all of our glitz and glam in terms of military procurement.
So multiple reasons on this one. First and foremost, this tank behind you, the base design was done by Chrysler Defense. So going all the way back into the 70s, when General Starry was a requirements manager, they largely got everything they needed correct. The characteristics of need, everything to do rail tunnel compliance, and even though that was a different threat set and a different environment, the reason we're doing an M1E3 here pays homage to both them, the city of Detroit, where this thing was engineered to begin with. If we looked at the bumper number, depending on how much of the tear-up we did, it may have been assembled at what used to be the old tank plant. Now, specifically here at the event, it presents us an opportunity, one, to put this back in the hands of the taxpayers so they can see what their investment is. This tank is real, and rather than wait until the fall and do it in that event, we can now bring it down here, generate a little bit of excitement. And in this town in particular, somebody knows somebody or had family going all the way back to World War II that made tanks in Detroit. So there was a lot of homage to be paid by doing it here. The tank was available and ready. And this is also a reflection of everything we're trying to do with acquisition reform. So it hits multiple targets in one shot.
And I know earlier you and I sat down, we were General George. He mentioned sort of bringing along a lot of these traditionally American auto manufacturers back into the fight, essentially, sort of trying to go towards that arsenal of democracy idea. One of the immediate questions that I have, and that I think applies to the operational prototype here, is what are some of the hurdles when it comes to things like Berry compliance and getting things through Congress? I mean, obviously this is a whole new approach to actually developing a prototype and getting it fielded quickly.
It is, but many of the pieces are already there. So the upside of doing, and the reason we did an engineering change proposal, that's what the E stands for, by the way, in M1E3, although I think we're going to stay with that. But I don't have to explain to Congress what the Abrams tank is, what it does, its mission set. So that makes it very clean. Then when you get into the technical details of the execution, as I like to say, we don't need steam engines anymore, but you still need a railroad in this country. So how you move, in the railroad example, how you move stuff around the country may change, and it's complementary, but the mission otherwise to move things are still the same. Amazon does it differently, but somewhere in that transportation system is that railroad again. So with the tank, being able to explain it and being modular, much as you've seen the tank here today, again, another reason why we're here. Show them that it's real. Can you network cameras and all of that? Yes. Why? There's no new science here. Everything we've had, we've always need. What is clean about it is the software side. How do you bring all the pieces together? How can I leverage then the industry partners that are here in this town? The good thing is Roush did the tank that's behind you. Could you say there?
Roush performed like the same guy
Yeah,
who did
like
the F1 and all that.
Yeah, exactly. NASCAR and all that. Yeah, exactly. People are like, what? Yeah, they've got a defense team, and they're a good team because they think differently by nature of that experience, right? That's what you leverage here in Detroit. You get a lot of the teams all consolidated here, so your talent pool is really big local to this environment. The other thing that's nice too is I don't have to get on an airplane and travel across the country and get calendars perfectly aligned when we have a challenge. So being able to have Roush within 30 minutes of the arsenal, when we had an issue or I wanted to swing by on my way home from work, I could go there, we could have a 5-minute conversation. That was our IPT, if you will, the Integrated Product Team meeting. And then I go about my business. It made conversation and communications very transparent, very fluid, and allowed us to move with speed. That's the beauty.
So you mentioned sort of folks being familiar with the Abrams tank.
Yep.
But this is a very different Abrams tank. Can you walk me through some of those major changes?
Right. So on the tank behind you, we're going to a 3-person crew. It's a remote turret. It's your height exposure. There's always been going all the way back to World War II. Where do you take the most hits? It's in the turret. Why? It's the most exposed. So it'd be nice to get people out of the turret, out of that exposure space. Now that's a classic direct fire fight. We had to make the tank ready for the current fight. So you got drones. So the R400, which is what that mount is up there, that RWS, and no, not all the weapons are doing that. I'll get to modularity and why we presented it that way. But Germans were buying that from a company called the EOS out of Australia, and they have, EOS has an arm down in Huntsville where they make those too for other markets to include here in the US. And they already had the software to shoot drones. So is it possible to shoot drones? The answer is yes. Now you have to have a human in the loop and all of that, but they already had the technology, so we could buy our way into the market. Now you just got to connect it to the rest of the tank. So the digital backbone that's on the tank, that's different. I don't have kludged together individual systems. We were talking about artillery earlier. You know, I may have an AFATADS over here, I may have JBCP, but never the twain shall meet. So Next Gen C2 brings those, I'll say now, cloud environments of data together so that regardless of where you are, I'll say in the system, not necessarily the vehicle, but in that software. So a software-defined tank, much more like a software-defined vehicle. The other thing that changes too is the crew stations are agnostic. So I don't have a dedicated driver, gunner, commander, loader. We do have an autoloader going forward. It will be highly reliable. Of all the things that we will be very deliberate about in test, and we will rigorously test to failure all the time, is going to be the autoloader. If that doesn't work, then everything else fails, but that is not hard. Lots of countries have autoloaders. We're one of the last ones to convert. So I'm confident that we will be steady state. So that's another change that goes into this. Some of the biggest changes, though, happened in the powertrain. As a subsystem, your engine and transmission on any combat platform constitute the highest cost, right? If you counted the turret, you know, you could say that is, but the gun, that's where separate is different than armor.
Right, and a lot of our money is going into the powertrain because that's what actually moves this
that's right.
massive vehicle around.
That's right. And back in the 70s, the best, most high-powered, dense system they could get was a turbine engine. At the time, it was common to the Huey, so they were doing commonality back then. That's not a new idea, new thought. And just like I learned going through a PhD program for metallurgy, you know, first thing you do is a lit review, read your history, right? So understand the history of all those things. Yes. But diesel technology, speaking of things, that was Caterpillar rep. Diesel technology's come a long ways. Back in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, they looked at it. It wasn't quite there. Well, now it is, and now it's available in the commercial market at scale. So now I can go from a bespoke manufacturing line. So what's the advantage of commercial? As the Army dials its budget up and down depending on the needs of the nation and the needs of the Army on top of that, then I can go to a supplier that, hey, if I'm buying engines, great. If I'm not buying engines, great. Guess what? The manufacturing line still is there. The challenge on the turbine engine is the Army has to maintain that industrial base. So in many ways, we own the factories where all the parts are made. Now I get a commercial entity, I offload that risk, so the powertrain gets infinitely cheaper. Diesel technology is that much better. And now I can tap into Caterpillar's worldwide distribution system. But that wasn't necessarily a decision of the Army. That was one of many engines we looked at from a risk reduction. We were looking at Cummins had the ACE engine at the time. We did evaluate that because the Army put a lot of investment into it. Rolls-Royce, which bought out Detroit Diesel, had a couple of engines. We looked at those. Those were made overseas. Could they onshore them? Yes, but again, bespoke military applications. Mm-hmm. So there weren't that many others when we did the original studies in partnership with all of our industry partners and then GD to look at that space. So that's different. And as we spiral down in weight, because now that the crew's out of the turret, well, you make the turret smaller. I don't need big armor cavities to protect the volume. And then as you spiral down, things like on this vehicle behind you, these are lighter weight systems. It may not seem like much, but it's amazing how much weight is in a track suspension system.
I was saying, you're talking about the tracks here.
And the wheels, right? So as you go down to 60 tons, the track is now 1 ton lighter. We didn't do anything fancy. Again, nothing crazy here, no exotic materials, but we took the older T-156 and just applied good engineering practices and finite element models that they didn't have back in the 80s. Easy to pull a ton of weight out. Different manufacturing methods. I think those are friction stir wheels. I think Hutchison make those particular ones. They're not the final evaluator, but they offered, and we're going to try out what their technologies can do. So when you begin to do that across the entire platform, that's how you spiral down. So your technical execution changes with the availability of the technology. I know that's a lot, like 5 minutes, but
no, yeah. It's good. I mean, you can see it looking at the vehicle, right? It is a skinnier tank,
yep,
for lack of a better term there, because between, you said, the hybrid powertrain,
yep,
the tracks, the redesign of the cockpit and the turret.
Yep.
So how much weight reduction did you end up having for the vehicle?
So when you look at the totality of the math, when the Army did have the CFT programs, General Kaufman at the time was the CFT director, and he said, Brian, no kits. So had to say, okay, so if I kit all the way up to include the current tank that we have, which is SEP V3, you have to count trophy in that because everything needs an APS. But we had to count for the new threat, which wasn't on the table, which at the time is now UAS. So you got to have a counter system for that.
Okay.
And then reactive armor, which again, we're not going to have all those classic things. So you have to be more reliant upon smarter technologies. APS has come a long ways.
APS?
Active Protection System.
Okay.
So Raphael's trophy system,
right.
Elbit's Iron Fist.
Right.
Those are the best in the Western world right now. Nobody else is even close. And you can go buy it. That's the best part. When we started doing this activity with GD, part of the stipulation and part of what I did on the team for the tank behind you is do not develop with a capital D new technologies. If you can't adapt it, right? Now you may have to develop software, that's okay. But what I wanted it to be is a larger integration function, right? Not a classical, hey, let's go develop a technology that doesn't exist, but future combat systems, right? Mm-hmm. That was a whole lot of things that you needed 8 miracles to occur. We're trying to reduce our miracles from 8 to like 3.
So the direction then was essentially, we need you to build us the next platform, but as you develop and build this platform, you need to go and look at what we have already made, what's already available, what's commercially available, and put those things together.
That's right. The gun is plenty lethal. We don't need a new gun and a new bullet. And then the other thing is well, how many times in the new environment are you going to do it? The Battle of Kursk is not going to happen again, right? But a drone war, yes, and we're seeing that now. The real question, because we get asked all the time, it's like, well, do you still need a tank on the battlefield? And I'm like, until something can replace that exact 120 right there.
Right, that main turret.
It's the most lethal direct fire weapon system, and at some point, a drone is just a slow-moving missile. Everyone's like, drones, and I'm like, well, what's the payload? That's what matters. It's a glorified shape charge, whoop-de-doo, right? Tank can handle that all day. So if you kill the drone at range, no big deal. High explosive doesn't do anything to the tank. So, and you start the armor, anti-armor, it's like, oh, I'll just go to a bigger drone. Okay, they get more expensive, they get slower, they get heavier, they get easier to kill, right? So when you begin to take all that out, now you're down to, I'm now highly protected, I'm highly mobile, I'm even more mobile than I was at 60 tons. I'm networked better than I ever was on the battlefield, so what are the potentials there? And I still carry the most lethal punch of any main battle tank on the planet. So until such time as there is a new technology to replace that main gun, you still have to be able to advance forward into the face of the enemy, breach their obstacles, however you define obstacle these days, whether it's a drone swarm or it's a ground robot swarm that acts like a minefield. It doesn't matter. You have to breach that to penetrate in order to achieve the Army's mission success. So tank's going to be around for a lot longer than probably people realize. Then you get into the debate, is it man or unmanned in the future, right? Is it a robot in the future? Yes, all great questions.
Well, and that's a great segue, because I feel like one of the things that this tank has, you've mentioned it, right, this software backbone, the opportunity for an unmanned system down the line is essentially there in the way that this was designed.
Yes.
But the current cockpit is actually something pretty impressive too.
Right.
The F1 racing seats, nice and cushy leather. I kind of poked at you guys a little bit earlier when we were talking. I said, there's no way that they're going to keep the cab symbol embroidered on the headrests anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, between that and sort of an F1 video game style controller, drive-by-wire.
Right. So if this is a podcast, but if you go to Fox 2 News website, that single station over there, that's on their website. We started with a Fanatec F1 gaming controller for an Xbox. Why? Because that's what we could go get.
Right.
The intent, going back to software defined, not only was that, but when the focus became, well, who am I engineering this for, right, as a collective system? It's not the current generation of soldier to a certain extent, because it's going to be a while before it's populated out in the fleet. Yeah, we're going to use our soldiers that we have, maybe our new soldiers that we have now, they'll likely be around long enough, but the older generations, it's not for them. So there's that precarious balance of they have all the wisdom and the knowledge, but is it relevant to the current environment and how you want to fight it? So we engineered this at 13-year-olds. Here's the other benefit too that we thought about through this, and I'm not saying it's happenstance, but it's just added benefits. Normally, if you're going to be, you're an artilleryman background, the first time you can fire a gun is after you've gone through all your requisite training.
That's right.
Then you go through OBC, and then you really don't get to do it until you get deployed to a unit. So you have this time gap from literally the time you're born up until you get that training before you go do it. Now, if I'm on F1 controllers, kids are used to it. I give them the same gaming environment, essentially. I get free training before they ever enter the service. So I get years, decades, and I get billions of hours worldwide of all these different gaming companies playing around with stuff. So the Army in this case, speaking of commercial, we don't always talk that. I just sit back and watch what are the trends in the gaming environment, and then I now have a software-defined tank with multiple screens. I now adapt to everything that they've learned. So shows that I've sent engineers to, Consumer Electronics Show. Pay attention to the gaming world, it's important. Now I just get to marry it with the actual gun, put the two and two together.
Right.
So a simulation now becomes a battlefield, but all the free training, all of that knowledge, I don't have to go through a requisite or exquisite training program to train a new soldier.
Right. So, and that seems to apply not just to the training of the actual soldier driving and operating the vehicle, also to the maintenance, also to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're using things that are already essentially familiar to the civilian population as much as you can.
That's right. Take the CAT engine, right? If I have to, I guarantee at places like Fort Hood, Texas, there's a CAT dealer nearby. And if I had to and our soldiers didn't have all the requisite training, take it down to the CAT dealer and they can fix it, or I can go get their parts. Even better in that case, I don't have to recreate manuals. CAT's already done that for their commercial customers. And so if you really need to learn on that, they've got thousands, if not millions, of trained operators that will know how to fix a C-13D. Right now, I've only got a handful of bespoke that know how to fix and repair that turbine engine.
And so whether it's a soldier that's actually operating the vehicle, whether it's the mechanic, you're effectively saying, I can hand off a good chunk of your training in just a simple and direct way where you already have a lot of familiarity with it.
That's right.
You already have either touched it in your daily life, gaming, or your specialty like a mechanic. And this is probably a fairly familiar system that is very, very well known and documented.
That's right.
And now I just need to train you on it. But parts are readily available, training's readily available.
Yeah.
I want to ask sort of one little final section here about the future of warfare. Right?
Yes.
You pointed at this turret, and when I look up at that turret, I see a Mark 19, a grenade launcher. I see a javelin. I see a chain gun.
Yes.
And you said that those are all going to effectively be able to be operated remotely from the interior of the vehicle.
That's right.
How are we changing? I mean, we're shifting and talking a lot about the software-defined environment for our vehicles, for our tactics even.
Right.
What is that going to look like in terms of those next training steps and those next goals and gates for commanders that are already in the field?
Right, so let's speak to where this tank is headed next. And I'll speak one thing on the turret. We put all those weapons in there just to show configuration. Are you going to put all of them in there? No. But now you get a classic, I'll say, infantry arms room concept. I can now package the right payload for the right mission. The fact that, okay, everyone's like, I love the analogies online. Oh, it looks like the Koreans, they stuck a missile up there. No, the whole point is I've got data and power, and I can host. The question is do you need to, do you want to, should you? Either way, we can now have a discussion about the art of the possible, right? So I need more stowed capability in terms of number of rounds, so maybe I want a smaller gun in there. You can go all the way up, I think, to the lightweight 30 on that particular one. It has its own optics. But the upside is it is now no longer treated as a bespoke one-off thing. So now this speaks to what else do you do with the turret, what else do you do with this? In a networked vehicle, your third, fourth, fifth crew member, if it's not the smarts on the tank, so everyone wants to talk AI, just good pragmatic algorithms and application of things that are out there. Driving technologies. Like I keep telling GD, now that they've got the formal contract, I'm like, no kidding, I want cruise control, or I want adaptive cruise control. I've got all these sensors. And then the other thing too is this, that sensor system that's up there for the adaptability in the future, it's not isolated to just the crew or just the vehicle. You could be sitting in an adjacent one. Commander can take an image off of their system or let somebody else do it. Because I'm like, hey, the commander and that crew need to rack out. Cool, I'm gonna use their tank from somebody else's station, pull their cameras up on my screen, and I'm gonna remote in, right? That's the potential. Are we there yet? No, so these tanks are gonna go to that unit. They're gonna begin to explore all those ideas. We may not have all the capabilities right now. That's where earlier in the interview I said it's software first. I'm going to make sure that we've got the bandwidth. Make no bones about it, we're going to play around with fielded HMS radios. One of the most important things we're going to do is a comms check later this year with Net Warrior. So can I take all the kit that is now fielded that's underneath Net Warrior and a part of NG's Next Gen C2 and be able to communicate with it? So we've got that. We're going to put Starshield on here. Yep. I want to be able to see how good and how robust that network is. And I got it. Everyone's like, you can mitigate Starshield. I'm like, yes, but I have different modes of degradation. I can go to HMS. I could go to other radios. The radio and the transport layer becomes a separate discussion. I can decouple it from the platform, but it shows the art of the possible. So the future of the warfare, that's why it's important we get these tanks in the hands of the soldiers and the commanders now. They're going to think of shit that we didn't envision, and they're going to employ this thing going, well, we didn't think of that one. That's really cool. Write this down, because I'm going to feed off of that going, I could now do this, this, and this. So we're going to iterate in that space. What we don't always think about is how we think about it. And we're not going to go back to, I'll say, big formal requirements discussion. The tank has to be the tank. That's the requirement. I now change where I draw my system envelope. It's no longer at the RWS. It's no longer at the crew station. It is the whole tank, or it is now the formation. So disaggregating workload functions relative to a digital architecture that can properly communicate. We're about to go find out.
Sir, thanks for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Not a problem. Yep, anytime.
This episode of the Threat Status Podcast is brought to you by Vector. The Army asked for 1 million drones. Vector is ready to build them at scale in the U.S. by warfighters for warfighters.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world, impacting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you all listen to the show, Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, has to do with Iran's ballistic missile program. My sources tell me that the Trump administration may have leverage right now in pressuring the Iranian regime to halt its killing of protesters and to get serious about slowing down its nuclear weapons activities, especially following the June 2025 U.S. and Israeli bombing raids on Iranian nuclear sites. But when it comes to ballistic missiles, there's a real concern in the U.S. national security community. We had an exclusive in Threat Status that we published this week about an overlooked detail in a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, analysis from May 2025 that said Iran's arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles could be expanding rapidly to the point that Tehran may have as many as 60 ICBMs by 2035. That would put Iran's total ICBM capabilities ahead of North Korea, which presently has 10 and is projected to have as many as 50 by 2035, according to this DIA analysis. That's my threat of the week, Ben. This issue of Iran's missiles is not getting enough attention. And of course, it is worth noting that DIA analysis was actually issued in May, about a month before the U.S. and Israeli bombing of Iran. So there are questions about how that June bombing campaign may have impacted the analysis. Hopefully listeners will go check out our coverage in the Daily Threat Status newsletter.
Yeah, that's interesting, Guy. I mean, that DIA one-page graphic, I remember, looking at it around the time it came out last year, sort of when the Golden Dome, right around the time I think that our Golden Dome event, Washington Times Threat Status Golden Dome event took place, but that was an underreported detail as part of that. So you're right, I think, to highlight it this week. My threat of the week is Chinese cyber threats to critical U.S. infrastructure. This is very much in the news right now, as it always seems to be. U.S. Army Lieutenant General Joshua Rudd, currently the Deputy Commander of Indo-Pacific Command and the President's nominee to be the Director of the NSA and the head of U.S. Cyber Command, he recently told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the U.S. needs to ramp up its efforts to block the planting of malicious software in control networks. Now, he said China is the most serious and sophisticated threat the U.S. faces in cyberspace, and particularly in this realm of cyber threat. And part of that is because of China's, basically their prolific nature, their ability when it comes to these kinds of attacks, the kinds where China-linked cyber actors essentially get into networks of U.S. water, power, transit systems, and deliberately pre-position access points that could potentially be used to hold American cities and communities hostage and enable disruption during a crisis or a conflict later on. Living off the land attacks is what they're called. We talk about them often on the show. Next week, we'll get into more of this with Congressman Andrew Garbarino, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. But to give you a sneak preview, his committee put out a recent report that detailed a 150% increase in cyber espionage attacks linked to China. And specifically, China's targeted attacks on financial services, media, manufacturing, and the industrial sectors, which increased 300%. According to that report. So these kinds of attacks are really all across the board. We'll dive deeper into it next week with Congressman Garbarino, but for now, Guy, it's my threat of the week. And with that, a huge thanks to our guest this week, Colonel Ryan Howell, and a big thanks to John Seward for that great interview at the Detroit Auto Show. And last but not least, of course, a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.